In the last video, I showed you guys how to make boards parallel to one another so that you're set for glue up so you can make your tabletop. Now, it's on to some fun. You can start to see the process come together, and I've got 3 ways to show you how you can combine them. Hey, I'm Jeff Devlin of Schoolhouse Woodworking. I'm a licensed contractor, woodworker. We named our company Schoolhouse Woodworking many, many years ago because the goal was to teach. Wow, that's nice. It's not always the perfect method, but it's a way that I've learned over the 30 years doing this that I believe sometimes simpler is better. So the first method for tabletop gluing your boards parallel is just simply glue. You have to make sure, again, to reiterate, you have to make sure that these 2 pieces of wood are parallel to one another and that they don't go in and out. For glue to work well, it needs 2 flat surfaces. And here's a perfect example. Now you're going to have to get in there good and tight. I'm just going to take these 2 pieces of plywood and I'm going to put glue on it right there, right? And I'm going to take it and I'm going to squeeze and manipulate that glue all the way around. And I'm going to let it go. This is how joinery was done a long time ago. If you did the joinery right, if I squeezed all of that glue out, and you'll see this glue squeeze out, and it's just a very, very thin layer. And what that creates is a nice bond. Now, most people will not be able to pull this apart, including me, because it's very tight. The only way for me to pull it apart is introduce air into it by sliding it to the left or right or up or down. And when I do that, you'll hear it. You can hear that, and you can see I've got even coverage. So glue, for the most part, is incredible these days. I use Titebond 3, 2, it doesn't really matter. But most importantly, when you're gluing up 2 pieces of wood, you want to make sure it's not a glue-starved joint. In this case, I'm just taking the glue and running it all the way down. Notice it's a nice even bead all the way down. I use my finger. You can get the fancy brushes if you want, but that's why Mama got me an apron for Christmas, because I can just wipe the glue off on the front like this, and I don't have to worry about it. But you'll notice, see the way each part of that is covered. Da, 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 da. Most people in their garage will have a bucket of glue. By the way, don't leave the glue in the garage to freeze, because a lot of the times once it freezes, it's no good. And now we would take this. I'll grab my clamps. Probably should have put the clamps down first. Some of the problem with this is that most people don't have a ton of clamps, so there is an investment in doing this. If you're doing this as a hobby, it's sometimes a hard sell to be able to go buy I guess each one of these clamps is probably around 20, 30 bucks. I like the bar clamps. That's just me. So you can see it can get kind of expensive. So that literally is the only downside to this method. You have to have a ton. So what I like about this is now I can get my clamps close, right? I can hold my fingers on the board like so and lift it in this area to make sure that it's smooth across the top and it's nice and flush, and then I'll start clamping. And you can see right away, see that little bit of squeeze out right there? I love seeing that. That means that I've got a nice even joint all the way across the board. Now this one's going to be a little more tricky. It's reclaimed wood, so we might have to just push down a little bit. And again, you can see that nice little squeeze out all the way down the board. The other nice thing, as long as you're not doing this in like broad daylight, the 90 degrees down in Texas, or 98 degrees with 1,000% humidity, this will dry pretty quick. So you can either choose to let that dry and scrape it off with like a putty knife or something like that, but I normally like to just grab my rag and just wipe it off. Another thing when you're using clamps is right here, and this happens more than I care to talk about. And actually there's a sort of a mistake, if you will. You can see the gap underneath. And that's just simply that I need to disconnect the clamp a little bit and push it down so it's flat. We don't want the board to be clamped in a compromising position. We want it to be clamped so it's nice and flat all the way down. So normally I take my whacker and I'll go down, this is going to be loud, And all I'm doing is setting them down so they're sitting nice and tight with the clamps, and we know that it's nice and flat. But right away you can see there's a nice simple joint, and if you can be patient, this might be your method. But maybe it's not, and that's why there's a number 2. We're on to method number 2, and method number 2 normally for me is for thicker, chunkier wood. It helps align the tops. It doesn't necessarily do too much, but heck, if you want to go buy yourself one of these fancy pants things, go for it. This is called a domino. What this does is you can see a drill bit that pops through. And when it's on, it comes through, it wiggles. It's like a dog's tail, so to speak. And it goes through and it drills and it creates a mortise. So therefore, if we want to utilize those, you have to mark because you need them to be adjoining or matched. So what I do is there's no rhyme or reason. They say you can do, I don't know, every 12 inches if you want. I just sort of eye it up. And then you'll notice I'm just using a square and marking. If these boards are off, it doesn't necessarily matter, especially if you're just going to trim them at the end of the day. So now you can see my little marks. All that's going to do is be a reference for me. I'm going to spin this board around and I'll cut the first one. I've got this already set up with an 8mm sized domino. This is the domino, and all of this is called a loose tenon. If you know mortise and tenon, mortise is the hole. The tenon is basically what would normally be cut out of a piece of wood. A loose tenon means instead of the tenon being cut out of the wood, there's just 2 mortises, and then you have this tenon that slides in on both sides. This is made of beech wood, so it's really, really hard. This process is pretty easy. All of the work is done right here. So the first one, I'll cut the first hole. There's a little line at the top of the tool. You can see right here where my finger is. Yep. And then I just line that up over top of my pencil line. I pull the trigger, push down, and voila, she's in. I always test it first so you can see the hole there. And then you can see, if we whack it in with our little whacker, you can see how tight it is. So it helps you align the tops, like so. I don't want to whack it in all the way because I don't want to be here all day trying to pull it out. And you can see the little ridges here, and those ridges are areas where the glue can get in and squeeze around. It gives you basically surface area for the glue to bond to it. So really strong. So at that point, it's just a rinse and repeat. So excuse me while I domino. Now, let the gluing begin. I'm going to squeeze a little bit in each hole. You don't want to go too crazy with glue in these holes, because if you put too much in there, it all is going to squeeze out. And there's all sorts of fancy brushes that you can use. I just prefer the little acid brushes used for plumbing. Just give it a whack. Truth be told, this could be any wood. We're using reclaimed wood to do this cool tabletop. This could be maple, oak, it doesn't matter what the type of wood is. So if you wanted to do it with plywood, you could, but it would be very difficult to hide the seam. And the seam is what we want. In this case, we kind of want it to, it's not going to go away completely, but if you're doing more of a modern piece of furniture, you're going to want to match the grain, and you're going to want to, make sure that it looks like one big slab. In this case, because it's a reclaimed piece, we want to really accentuate the fact that they're big, wide boards, and that they're cool and old. They don't really make boards this wide, this stable anymore. The trees that they use, or the way it's harvested and how quickly it grows, it's more susceptible to warping and not being straight. These boards are over 100 years old, and you can see with a little attention, they can do some amazing stuff. Whereas you go to a big box store and even a lumber yard, some of the fancier ones today, you're going to buy boards that are all crooked and crazy, and that's why your project goes all awry. Now, I've got that done. In a perfect world, they should line up perfectly. They should line up, in a perfect world, they should perfectly line up. Don't stand in front of it when you use the air gun, like that. Never works well. So, what I like to do is I start at the one end. Because there's no real wiggle room for this, you just start to slowly whack it. Go in! So it's nice and set. Now I can see how tight that is. Now, I'm going to clamp it. If you're doing this outside, and I can't stress this enough, if you don't start clamping this early, if you're out in broad sunlight, really hot outside, the glue will start to dry right away. That process of it curing creates a skin on it. So therefore, when I take this glue and I rub it like this, it's still somewhat liquidy. So what happens when it gets cured, it starts to skin over, and that skin creates a very bad bond when you're doing stuff like this. So you gotta kind of be quick. And the nice thing about those dominoes is they will actually help me. I remember before I had to worry about the top surface and make sure that it was perfectly flush. I don't now, because they will line up the tops evenly. So if you're doing a ton of these and it's not just a hobby, you might want to consider stepping up a bit and grabbing yourself a fancier tool like that Domino. You'll use it a lot, I guarantee you. Voila. Same deal as before, just wipe it off. I'll sand dot that all off. Now, if you're using like a fancier wood, you can actually just wait for it to dry and scrape it off with a putty knife. Who's ready for number 3? This guy right here. So for our last method, we're going to take all 4 of these boards and join them together. So our one method that we used here, which was the Domino, and then we'll take just our glued boards, and then our last one is going to be the easiest of all. I wanted to pull it out like a rug or something like that. It didn't work. You know when you pull out the tablecloth? Didn't work. With number 3, we're going to use a pocket hole. Now, a pocket hole is actually really simple to do. However, you need the pocket hole jig to do it. There are 3 different versions of that same jig. You can start with the cheapest version right here. This is, I think, called the R3. You can see right here, it sets it up. So you set it. There's little increments of the thickness of the wood. I don't know if you can see there. I know I can't because I can't see my hands without my glasses. So these can move, and you can see, you can go different thicknesses. I'm going to use, because we're using 3/4 inch material, we're going to set it to 3/4 of an inch. Now the beauty in this, in the pocket hole jig, is that, again, it's a jig. It takes thought out of the equation, which is something that will help you make less mistakes. So in this case, this is the first jig. This is like 35, 40 bucks or something like that. You're just going to take it and you're going to clamp it onto your workpiece. Now you need a clamp. You could use any clamp, but Craig has these cool auto adjusting clamps, like so. Now you've got this stepped drill bit. It's proprietary to this system. I don't want to get too crazy into it, but this collar allows you to not make mistakes. Once this is set to the thickness of the wood, literally put it in the hole here and pull the trigger. And voila, you've got the perfect angle hole So you basically, when you run your screw through, you can see it's at the right angle and you're using the right length of the screw so it binds across the grain. So if you look at right here, you look at the grain in the wood going this way, the screw on this piece of wood will go like this. This is a really strong joint. I'm going to pull this one out, and then I'm going to show you the second jig, which is a bigger version of the same thing. This has its clamp inside of it, has the same method, 3/4 of an inch right here. This is the insert that slides right in. The reason why I like this one is because now, and I'm going to have to flip this so it's angled to me, I can actually put the board, especially a bigger board like this, I can stick it right in and then clamp it like so. So now this is clamped in to the workpiece. I have to lift the other side just a little bit so that way it's nice and level. There, so you've got a nice level spot. Come on, come on. There you go. So now that's locked into place. I can take my stepped drill bit again and then just run the hole. And notice, here's the best part about it. If you're just starting carpentry, you can't screw up. You can't push this to a point that it won't go any further. That's the beauty in this. Once this is set up correctly, and when you set it up correctly, you probably make a ton of mistakes, but once it's set up correctly, I never change it. This drill goes placed over there. That is for my 3/4 inch material, and I just use it every single time, that same bit. And then last but not least, the Mac Daddy of pocket hole machines is right over here, where it's the same thing. And if you look right here, the drill bit comes up from the bottom. So less thought involved. I can just put it on there, pull the trigger. Much easier. Now, the trick with this is because of the angle that the screw goes through the wood, it wants to push the wood. Because of the angle, it's going to want to push this wood and suck it down that way. So you need to clamp it. You can't just hope for the best. So what I do is I'll grab a clamp, and this is, they call them face frame clamps. And you go over top of the joint and you just clamp it. Now, because I can't get to that joint in the middle, they make different clamps. This one's a little bigger to get to those hard to reach areas. Now, you'll notice once I screw it, it looks nice and sloppy right now because of the way it's sitting on the table. But once it's pushed together, watch it get nice and tight. Voila. You can see the glue squeeze out. I'll just throw a couple more and then we can flip it over. You can see that get nice and tight. Now, with this one in the middle, I don't have a clamp big enough to reach that. So I can position this and push it down. If you are going to get stuck in this position where it's hard because it's in the middle of the board, there are ways to cheat. There's always a way to cheat in woodworking, always. And one of those methods is that you have to have a flat board underneath, and I have to apply pressure to this board itself to keep the one opposite where the screw is going through down, and make sure that it's forced down so that way when I run the screw, you can see the glue squeeze up right there. It doesn't pull the board up at the same time, if that makes sense. And voila. You've got 3 different ways that you can combine your tabletop. So you've got number 1, which is just simply glue. Number 2, which is a domino and a tool. And number 3, you can use the Craig jig to put it all together. And now, you're getting somewhere.